is Dr. Jennifer Guerrero. I'm a psychologist at Parkland Hospital, and I'm also a member of the Hallmark family. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about how brains grow. So, a lot of people emphasize the importance of the first 3 years of life. Why is that? Well, at birth, babies have over 100 billion neurons, and they have almost the number of neurons that they'll need for their entire life. However, there's a huge amount of development that happens within the first 3 years of life. From the first breath to the third year, 80% of the brain is developed. And so there's a lot of change going on in babies' minds from the very beginning to the age of 3. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because what happens in those first 3 years? Babies learn to walk, they learn to talk, oftentimes they learn to read, to count, and all of that starts from scratch. So there's a lot of learning going on. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the ways that parents, grandparents, siblings, and schools help babies develop. Okay, so how do babies make sense of their environment and learn all this information? Well, the key is strengthening neurons. So if you look at the picture that's on this slide, you'll see 2 neurons with what look like branches connecting them. And so they're not actually touching, they're just a tiny bit far apart, and there's neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, that send signals back and forth. And so when we get some kind of input from our environment, we see something, we smell something, we touch something, it activates those neurons. And certain neurons will activate and send information down the chain. And so the more some neurons are activated, the stronger the connection between the 2 neurotransmitters gets. And the brain knows that this is important information, we need to keep it. Over time, the brain notices when there are neurons that there are very few connections. And so through a process known as pruning, they'll cut off those connections, those neurotransmitters that don't get used very much. That's why it's much easier to learn something like a second language when you're 2, 3, or 4 years old, as opposed to when you're 45, 55, 65 years old, because there's so much potential in these neurons. And when you activate some of these neurons, they get strengthened over and over time. So some of those neurons that may be related to learning Spanish, learning French, learning German may have been pruned off. The good news is that our brains are very, very resilient. There's something called neuroplasticity, which basically means that our brains can reroute and rewire themselves to bypass old connections or broken connections and forge new ones. That's why it's still possible to learn a language and to learn new skills when you're much older in life. Okay, so how do we strengthen these connections between neurons in children and babies? Well, one of the things that's very important is repetition. So if you'll notice, babies and children will often repeat the same thing over and over again. And sometimes that's to try to establish cause and effect. Like, every time I drop this ball, does it fall on the floor? And oftentimes that repetition, it's comforting and it's soothing because it reinforces those neural pathways. And that's oftentimes why children like to hear the same story over and over again, sing the same songs over and over again, and play the same games over and over again. So sometimes it can take a little bit of patience, but one of the best things that caregivers can do is to go ahead and repeat songs, stories, games, anything that a child wants to hear over and over again, because the familiarity of it helps reinforce those connections between neurons. One of the other things that parents can do and other caregivers can do that's so important is to let children observe as much as possible. One very important example is language. So there are studies that show that the more words that children hear, and it doesn't matter if it's baby talk or regular talk, the better that they are at language when they do learn to talk and read. So even talking about what you do at the grocery store, the errands you have that day, what you see out of the car window, talking to children helps them reinforce those neural pathways in the part of their brain that controls language. And children that hear more and more words from books, from their parents talking, have a major advantage in language development down the road. Another thing that is so important that researchers are just starting to learn more about is the importance of affection in developing brains. So the picture that you see in the PowerPoint is an experiment done by Harry Harlow, who made two puppets, monkey puppets. One was basically a wire frame with a bottle, so with food, and one was a soft, cuddly puppet with no food. And they put baby monkeys in the cage and let them choose which puppet they preferred to cuddle with. So even though they knew that the cuddly puppet didn't have any food, that's the puppet that they chose to be with. And so, building on some of that research, experts have found that affection has a huge impact on children's ability to reinforce those neural connections. It helps build a buffer of what's called myelin, the protective sheath around our brains. And so without that myelin, neurons will die off. And so the more that you can give children physical affection, emotional support, really helps build up their brains.